Hello, and welcome to Mysteriously Unexplainable. Um, yeah, spooky sounding. Okay, well, this 15-minute podcast is just me reading out of the book Mysteries of the Unexplained, which is like this old Reader's Digest book. So, let's see here. We'll open this up, and it's from 1982 is the year I'm seeing here. So, this book has stories from, well, let's see. The table of contents says, The Endless Search for Answers, Beyond the Walls of Time, Unearthly Fates, Monsters and More, The Unquiet Sky, and In the Realm of Miracles. So, I'm just going to open up to literally a random page. And we can read about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This was this guy literally started World War II, from what I understand. So let's see what this book has to say about time and the death of the Archduke. The assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria at Sarajevo, Yugoslavia on June 28, 1914, was one of the immediate causes of World War I. In the early morning of June 28th, the Archduke's former tutor, Bishop Joseph Lanyy, woke from a terrible dream. I dreamed that I had gone to my desk early in the morning to look through the post that had come in. On top of all the other letters there lay one with a black border, a black seal in the arms of the Archduke. I immediately recognized the latter's writing, and I saw at the head of the notepaper in blue coloring was a picture like those on picture postcards, which showed me a street and a narrow side street. Their Highness sat in a car. Opposite them sat a general and an officer next to the chauffeur. On both sides of the street there was a large crowd. Two young lads sprang forward and shot at their Highness. The text of the letter was as follows. Dear Dr. Lanyy, Your Excellency, I wish to inform you that my wife and I were victims of a political assassination. We recommend ourselves to your prayers. Cordial greetings from your Archduke Franz Sarajevo, June 28th, 3:15 a.m. Trembling and in tears, I sprang out of bed and I looked at the clock, which showed 3:15. I immediately hurried to my desk and wrote down what I had seen and read in my dream, and in doing so I even retained the form of certain letters just as the Archduke had written them. My servant entered my study at 5:45 that morning and saw me sitting there pale and saying my rosary. He asked whether I was ill, and I said, Call my mother and the guest at once. I will say Mass immediately for their Highnesses, for I have had a terrible dream. My mother and the guest came at 6:45. I told my mother the dream in the presence of the guest and of my servant. Then I went to the house chapel. The day passed in fear and apprehension. At 3:30, a telegram brought news of us of the murder. Bishop Lany's dream was inaccurate in two details. There was only one assassin, and the officer was not sitting next to the chauffeur. He was standing on the car's running board because of an earlier unsuccessful bomb attack on the Archduke. And that comes from Keith Ellis from Prediction and Prophecy, pages 101 and 102. So, in this story presented, the priest decided that he was going to have a dream about the Archduke being assassinated, and it really happened. So that's weird, almost down to the exact details. So now I'm going to turn the pages to some random pages here, and let's do. Okay. What's this? When we hear of expeditions seeking lost cities, we think of the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadores in the 16th century dream of El Dorado. But another such expedition set forth into Brazil's little-known Mato Grosso on April 20th, 1925. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett, an archaeologist, geographer, and adventurer whose dreams of discovery were no less vivid and alluring than those of their conquistadors. They led him, his son Jack, and their companion Raleigh Rimmel to an unknown fate in a forbidding land. Fawcett had served in Great Britain's Indian Army in Ceylon at the turn of the century, spending his free time searching for ancient tombs and treasures. Going to South America, he spent the years 1906 to 1909 surveying a long and excessively unhealthy sector of the Brazilian-Bolivian frontier. At the end of that period, he carefully studied an 18th century Portuguese account of a great city that lay in ruins but was purportedly rich in gold and gems. Convinced that the city existed, indeed, that Brazil's lost cities predated even those of Egypt, Fawcett and his party started out from Cuiabá. I've never heard of that place before. Traveling light and planning to live off of the country. His last dispatch, dated May 30th, stated in part, "We've cut our way through miles of Soraba, a forest of low, dry scrub. We've crossed innumerable small streams by swimming and fording. We've climbed rocky cliffs of forbidding aspect. We've been eaten by bugs. We shall not get into interesting country for another 2 weeks." The world heard no more from Fawcett and his companions, because he had warned that they would be gone for at least 2 years, and because his wife was convinced he was well, there was no search party until May 1928, and by then the trail was cold. Indians from several of the mutually hostile tribes in the area accused each other of killing the explorers. Others told of seeing the Englishmen near death from disease and exhaustion. For more than a decade, travelers returned with stories that Fawcett had gone native, a half-mad old man in rotting rags among the Indians, but no convincing evidence ever emerged to resolve the mystery. What do you think? Do you think that guy's still out there, maybe? Just like, how old would he have to be? 100 years old? Out in South America? Percy Fawcett. I think I've heard of him before. I'm not really sure. Here, let's turn to a random page. Alright, here we go. Large fish fell from the sky at Faridpur, India, on February 19th, 1830. The following eyewitness accounts are from 9 depositions made originally in Bengali and translated into English in the December 1833 issue of the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. I'd been doing my work at a meadow whenever I perceived at the hour of 12 o'clock the sky gather clouds and begin to rain slightly. Then a large fish, touching my back by its head, fell to the ground. Being surprised, I looked about, and behold, a number of fish likewise fell from heaven. They were sal, sail, guzal, mergal, and bodul, all local species. I took 10 or 11 fish in number, and I saw many other persons take many. That's the testimony of Sheikh Chudri Ahmed. On Friday at 12 o'clock p.m. in the month of Falgun, whenever I was at work in a field, I perceived the sky darkened by clouds, began to rain a little, and a large fish fell from the sky. I was confounded by the sight, and soon entered my small cottage, which I had there, but I came out again as soon as the rain had ceased, and found every part of my hut scattered with fish. That's amazing. It says they were Budali, Margal, Nuchi, and amounted to 25 in number. That's the testimony of Sheikh Suduruddin. So these people are... It's like 18... Imagine it being like 1830, and it just starts raining fish. There must have been some kind of a normal explanation for that. Or do you think it's mysteriously unexplainable? Okay, the very last story I'm going to tell is the Barney and Betty Hill encounter. This is a pretty popular one. A lot of people know about this, but if you haven't heard of Barney and Betty Hill, here you go. The Barney and Betty Hill encounter with a UFO in 1961 and their subsequent abduction revelations, brought out under hypnosis by a Boston psychiatrist in 1964, were sensational front-page news and the subject of books for several years. Here's what happened around midnight, September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney Hill were returning to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire after a vacation in Canada. They were driving south on U.S. Route 3 and just past the village of Lancaster when they saw a moving light in the sky. Stopping the car and getting out, they noticed the object was moving on a very erratic course. They then drove on, stopping every now and then to check the moving, soundless light. As they reached the White Mountains, the object, now appearing much larger, seemed to be moving in a course parallel to their car. Near Indian Head, it suddenly appeared directly in front of them, leaving the engine running. Barney got out of the car to observe the object with a pair of binoculars. He saw 5 to 11 figures moving behind a double row of windows. Betty, watching her husband from the side of the car, heard him repeating, "I don't believe it, I don't believe it," adding, "This is ridiculous." Herself, she did not see the descent of the UFO nor the humanoid figures observed by Barney. They were dressed in shiny black uniforms that looked like leather and wore black caps with visors. They moved with odd military precision. By now the UFO was only about 70 feet overhead and some 100 feet distant. Barney dashed back to the car, yelling, "They're going to capture us!" pushed down the gas pedal and drove off as though possessed. As they streaked away, Betty could not see the object, but Barney thought it was directly above them. Suddenly they heard a beeping noise like the sound of a tuning fork, and they felt very drowsy. They found themselves driving, about 2 hours later, in the vicinity of Ashland, 35 miles south of Indian Head. They drove home, feeling puzzled and uneasy about the missing 2 hours. The next day they reported their experience to Peace Air Force Base, and the incident was carefully recorded. A few days later, Betty got in touch with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP, in Washington, D.C. A special investigator was sent out to document both their stories. 10 days after the incident, Betty began to experience recurring nightmares. In them, a group of 8 to 11 men dressed in matching uniforms and military caps would stand in the middle of the road to stop the Hills' car. The leader would assure the couple that they would not be harmed. Then the Hills would be led on board a disc-shaped craft and examined. Samples of hair, fingernails, and scrapings of skin would be taken from Betty. Afterward, the couple would be returned to their car and allowed to drive home. The UFO experience resulted in unbearable feelings of persistent anxiety for both Hills. Eventually, they consulted Dr. Benjamin Simon, a prominent Boston psychiatrist who specialized in treating personality disorders and amnesia through hypnotherapy. Dr. Simon treated the Hills for 6 months, starting in January 1964. During this period, under time regression hypnosis, some amazing details were revealed. The Hills' stories about their abductors' appearance and actions seemed to match closely. The gist of what they remembered under hypnosis was very much like the content of Betty's nightmares, their abduction so that they might be physically examined. One of the most fascinating aspects of the case concerns the star map the leader showed Betty when she asked him where he was from. The map was drawn by Betty under post-hypnotic suggestion. Several years later, an astronomical investigation based on newly published data that was not known in 1961, revealed a cluster of stars near 2 stars called Zeta Reticuli that is amazingly close in configuration to the map drawn by Betty. This match has become a very controversial subject among UFO investigators and several members of the scientific community. Dr. Simon has expressed the professional opinion that the Hills' account of their abduction by UFO-nauts was a fantasy. The reason the Barney's account matched Betty's so closely was that he absorbed and believed all the details Betty experienced in her dreams and then recounted to him. People do not necessarily tell the factual truth while they're under hypnosis. All they tell is what they believe to be the truth. The Encyclopedia of UFOs, Ronald D. Story, pages 172 through 77. The Humanoids, Charles Bowen, pages 239 to 41. Okay, so what do you folks think about that? The Betty and Barney Hill experience, I guess? You're just driving along the road from Canada, all of a sudden you see a spaceship up above you. You look at it with binoculars and you end up getting abducted. I don't know. Well, if you've liked this edition of Mysteriously Unexplainable, join me next time, which will probably be tomorrow, for more stories out of this amazing 1982 edition of Mysteries of the Unexplained by Reader's Digest. I am Donnie, and I will talk to you later. Thank you so much for tuning in.